Are you ready for an embarrassing true confession? Last time I queried, an agent requested a full manuscript, which is always exciting, but then she got to me ages later, claiming that while the premise and my story and most of my writing were really fantastic, the dialogue wasn't naturalistic enough. What? Casting aside the fact that the dialogue was actually a smaller, more readily editable aspect of that book, and that I think the agent probably just figured out that she needed something more specific than, sorry, it wasn't for me after that much time. This comment really sent me into something of a tailspin. Up until that point, honestly, I was pretty confident that my dialogue in my books was just fine. That's kind of the insidious thing, though. Dialogue in a book, in fact, shouldn't be naturalistic to be effective. It, in fact, needs to be so carefully crafted that it feels natural when, in fact, it's working really, really hard in the background. And that's why it actually is important for all of us to do a little dialogue audit on our work on a pretty regular basis, especially if we're reasonably sure that we're doing it right. The problem is dialogue feels like it should come naturally. After all, what's more natural than speaking to each other and chatting? This is how we communicate. We communicate emotions, we build relationships, we share information, and yes, we lie, and we mislead, and we insult, and we gossip, we misdirect. The things that we say can also have these unintended, sometimes catastrophic, cataclysmic effects. Things that are said in conversation can be used to wound and destroy. Our words can turn against us. And in fact, sometimes all it takes is a single word. Sounds pretty important, right? I agree. So even though I feel that many of us feel that we've got this dialogue thing down, that we're totally okay with it, our dialogue is fine, you're not the ones who are going to get rejected by an agent because your dialogue was not naturalistic enough. I didn't think that either. So why don't we, in this episode of the How to Be an Author podcast, why don't we discuss dialogue? I think it's going to be absolutely worth it to make your book as good as it can be and to prevent you from getting rejected for something like that. If you're a writer dreaming of becoming a successful author, join me, writing coach Karenna Akavane, on the How to Be an Author podcast, your weekly source for writing information, inspiration, and motivation. Welcome to the How to Be an Author podcast. I'm so happy you're joining me today, especially for this very important episode. It's going to be reasonably short, but sweet and dense, full of information that you can use to improve your writing in significant ways. So you may want to take some notes. And of course, you can always sign up on my website and you'll be getting a bunch of these podcasts in article or blog form. You'll also be able to re-listen to this podcast. And I have little mini courses coming up that can help. And also, don't forget that you can always join my writing group. This is where you can actually get feedback on your writing in real time, as well as super inspirational information sessions where we talk about some of these crucial elements of writing and of the writer's life. So let's dive right in to this dialogue thing. Dialogue does so much heavy lifting in our written work. We use it for many different things. We use it, for example, to switch up the pacing in our writing. And it also needs to do things like provide information, reveal characters, especially characters who aren't point of view characters. And it also, of course, defines relationships. In fact, I would say that dialogue is the ultimate expression of show, don't tell. And unfortunately, I have to admit that when it comes right down to it, I think that many of us aren't that confident about our ability to do dialogue correctly. or write. And there's not just one way to do it because dialogue very much reflects the author's voice. I've seen different writers do dialogue in all different ways, and in many senses, it works in a bunch of different ways. Now, here's the important thing. I'm going to front load this piece of advice. However you do your dialogue, make sure to stay consistent when it comes to how you format and use punctuation. That's really crucial. So what are we going to be talking about today in general? We're going to be talking about the power of words a little bit, which we touched upon in our introduction. We're going to talk about what dialogue can do for your work. And I'm going to give you the top tips that I have for making dialogue work for your story without wrecking your pacing and bogging it down. We're going to be talking about some really common dialogue mistakes that really sneak their way into your dialogue. We're going to talk troubleshooting on what to do when your dialogue just isn't working. I am going to be talking a little bit about those pesky little formatting tips. They are a necessary evil. And many of you have asked me this question in the past. What the heck do we do about said? That's right. All those dialogue tags, he said, she said. Do we use said or do we use other crazy words? We'll be discussing all of that today. So let's rewind to what dialogue does in our story. A major feature of dialogue is that it absolutely will move your story forward, and it does so in a much more natural way than some kind of narration or explanation by the narrator possibly could. It can hide some little hints in a way that's pretty sneaky and subtle, and it also multitasks, so it doesn't feel like you're dragging down a passage with a bunch of description or explanation. It does things like developing characters. Characters can even evolve with the push and pull that dialogue provides because there are dynamics in dialogue. Often in dialogue, you'll have one person who's teaching someone something, or they're instructing them on something or filling them in, and the other person is getting the information. Sometimes in a dialogue, you've got, for example, imagine someone mansplaining to somebody else. Now, imagine that dynamic. Imagine how those two characters are going to push and pull against each other to evolve a little bit in the course of these dialogues. Think about the dialogue between a teacher and student, or a boss and their employee, or between two lovers, or between a child and their parent. Each one of those dialogues has its own dynamic. And I really think that it would be useful if you spend a lot of time thinking about the realistic ways in which those dynamics can be expressed. Dialogues will define characters not only in the way in which they speak, which that's definitely important. So this is the first thing where I think there can be a little bit of troubleshooting. So many writers will think, oh, I absolutely need to differentiate my characters through their speech. So they'll have a character who has a lisp, and they'll have a character who speaks in these very direct rat-tat-tat-tat type of sentences. And then the character who's smart, so they use all of these erudite words. And the problem is sometimes these things come off as not very realistic. Subtlety is key. And also think about the types of people who will be coming across each other in a conversation, especially if they're friends. Yes, let's admit it. Friend groups sometimes end up sounding very alike. So yes, you want to define your characters. Yes, you want them to have some little verbal tics maybe that define them, or some little speaking habits that they may have. But be really careful not to fall into caricature and absolute cliche when it comes to certain things. Now, let's also think about how a dialogue provides information. We're going to go back over this, but I don't want you to info dump in your dialogue. I always joke about the worst possible dialogue one could possibly write. There are a few TV shows that do this, and I'll be nice. I won't mention which ones they are, but this type of dialogue is, for example, when you hear someone say, Wow, Susan, this reminds me of that time 5 years ago when you got really angry at that man who was responsible for your mother's death and you stabbed him with that really rare knife. Is that the knife we're looking for today, Susan? Okay, this is too much information in the dialogue, right? And it's too many complete sentences, repeating names, things like that. You can't do that if you want to write good dialogue. But having those little pieces of information in the dialogue leaves a lot more space outside of the dialogue for all the fun stuff that is the action and the description. And it really helps you to play with the pacing in key ways. Look at how your characters interact with each other as well. So when you have dialogues between characters, I think it's important to be judicious. I have had some issues where I'm doing kind of a basic edit of my book, and I'll be looking at the conversations that my characters are having. And many times I'll see this problem. A character is going to have a long, drawn out discussion with another character, and then they don't have any more discussions with that character. Now, this might be something that's really important for the story, but in general, realistically, let's say your character is trying to get some kind of information or they're trying to make their place in the world, they're in high school, what have you. I think that it's good to have your character, and this is a little character development hack, show your character having at least 3 dialogues with the same character so that you can demonstrate how their relationship changes, their interactions change, and how the character has progressed, grown, and changed throughout, and show how their relationship is maybe deepening or maybe falling apart. You know, it lets you to show which changes are happening in the secondary character as well. And I think that that's really, really cool to do, but you need to have multiple conversations with the same person in order for that to work. It really does show change without you directly having to tell, right? So it'll show your character without you having to say, Carrie and Susie were getting along better than before. You don't have to say that. You show 3 conversations with Carrie and Susie, and now we've got that wonderful change that we've shown, and we can just move on with other things in the story after that. So here's some other little hacks. I gave you my first little hack, and maybe in order of how to give advice on dialogue, that wasn't the first hack to give because I think it's actually kind of a sophisticated hack. But here's some other little hacks that you can use for your dialogue to make it more natural sounding, even though natural dialogue has a lot of these things. So for example, when you see a friend, you meet up with someone, what's the first thing you do? Chit chat, right? The greetings, the hey, how are you? How's it been going? How's your mom? How's your kid? How are classes? This small talk is really how we weave our relationships, and it's how we keep up with people. It's how, we learn the information that we want to have on our friends. But in the book, oftentimes, the greetings and the small talk are not necessary unless something happens in them. It was Alfred Hitchcock who said that drama is life with all the boring bits cut out. I think that that's really smart. So the first hack here would be cut out the fluff. Cut out all of those little greetings, things that are said commonly by people that don't add anything to your particular plot. I think that's really important. So remember that your reader's not going to want to read all that stuff. They're going to assume that that stuff has happened. And you can just in one phrase say, Carrie greeted Susie, and then cut straight to the chase where they actually say the important things. So I think that's really important so that you can kind of skip forward to get to the important things. And of course, this also means that you skip the closings, right? Oh, when am I going to see you next? What are you doing next? Are you going on a trip? Whatever. Unless that's crucial to the story, you're not going to mention that. Okay, another thing that happens often in people speaking to each other in dialogue, especially if it's a teacher or a boss or a parent, there's going to be a long monologue, right? Where somebody's lecturing you pretty much. Somebody's going to be taking a lot of the airtime, so to speak, on this dialogue. Maybe one character is just going, yep, 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 and the other one's speaking. Now, I know a lot of you cheat with your dialogue. Instead of doing the backstory info dump, you're going to put it all in dialogue where you have a character explaining something to another character. Don't deny it. I've done this too. I'm a little mortified. And in fact, in one of my books, I still have a scene that I think I'm still doing a little bit of info dumping through dialogue. But here's a tip that's going to really help you to avoid that so that you don't make the mistake that I did. It's the 3-beat rule. There's a screenwriter named Cynthia Whitcomb, and she came up with this. And it's the 3-beat rule is basically after 3 beats of dialogue, which is like 3 little phrases or things that you can say without pausing for a breath. So this is where you kind of read your dialogue out loud, and it'll really help you to see, how it's sounding. After that, you're going to need a dialogue tag. And I would even say that you could probably have not only a dialogue tag, but maybe have the other character in the dialogue say something. I think that that's pretty good, or describe what the character's doing. Because remember, part of dialogue, you're not having big chunks of dialogue going back like a ping pong game of he said this, she said that, he said this, she said that. No, I want you to scene set. I want to see these characters moving around the scene and doing things. I want to see their facial expressions. I want to see their body movements that are giving away what they're thinking. I want to see what they're doing while they're speaking so that I feel like this dialogue's not happening in a white room. It's happening in a real space in your book. And I think that that's a really, really important thing to remember. One of the little tips that I give my writers when they worry about whether their balance of dialogue to description is appropriate in their story is I tell them to print out a couple pages and look at your pages. Because normally when you format dialogue, you can tell what's dialogue and what's something else. So look and see visually, is your scene too dialogue heavy? Okay, let me put in a little bit of description so that I have the context for the dialogue. And this helps me with my world building. This helps the reader to really feel like this story is happening in this interesting setting. So instead of saying something like, "Hey, how are you?" she asked. "Fine," he said. "Are you enjoying that coffee?" she asked. "Yes," he said. You can write something that's more akin to, Carrie stared at John. He looked exhausted. His eyes were at half-mast. He sat slumped in the diner's booth. "How are you?" she asked. He took a while to answer. "Fine." She knew he was lying. His shirt was torn. There was blood on his knuckle. What in the world had he been up to? He took a sip of coffee, avoiding her gaze. "How's your coffee?" she asked. "Fine," he said. Now she knew he'd completely shut her down. See how you're getting a lot more information for the scene? That's pretty good. But you heard that a few times I'm using said, right? Said gets such a bad rap. People think it's boring. People think it's overused as a dialogue tag, but we are not in elementary school anymore. I see so many videos on TikTok, for example, where people are like, "Oh, here's some great things you can use to replace the word said." And to which I say, honestly, I don't think it's important to have different words for said unless it's really warranted. Most of the time, readers don't notice words like said because their attention is on what the speakers are saying. And also, said is one of those throwaway words. The times that they are going to notice said is when it's always in the same spot. So, for example, if it's always at the end, she said, he said, she said, he said, and we just have a whole line of these where you see said going down all in a line, then people definitely are going to start to notice. But otherwise, I don't think you want to be using these bizarre verbs as a way to save yourself. I think that when you're like gasped or grumbled or mumbled, sometimes that's warranted, yes. But oftentimes you can use that description that I talked about previously to really fill in the blanks as to how the character is speaking. So forget those fancy tags because they might really turn off your reader, especially when they're kind of awkward. And I've made a few videos about this where I laugh at some of the more awkward speech tags that I've seen in writing, and they're all pretty funny. So how do you add variety? Well, you definitely are going to alternate in the types of structures, right? So you can have these different action beats that are before and after your dialogue. You can interrupt your dialogue with action beats. So just vary that structure. Use the dialogue tags sparingly and when you need them. And also this whole he said, she said, make sure when you're reading your dialogue and have someone else read your dialogue as well. The most important thing is we want to know who's speaking at all times. And there are multiple ways of doing this. And it's not only by giving somebody an accent that you transcribed, phonetically. In fact, I think that's a pretty bad idea. I think that you really want to make sure, though, that you are making it crystal clear who is speaking. And remember how I was talking about that backstory and people who info dump and do too much exposition in the dialogue, the whole, remember when your mother died 5 years ago, blah, blah, blah. You have to be really careful when you're doing that, okay? So yes, it's good to have one character in the dialogue who doesn't know the history so that you can explain things to them, but please resist the urge to do this over the top because it really rings false. That's absolutely not natural at all. And I think you really want to do it in moderation. One of the other hacks that I give, and you're going to hate this so much, but you know what? It really helps in the end. Once you've written your initial dialogue, put it aside for a week or something so that you have a nice fresh idea on what it looks like and cut out about half of it. That's right. I said about half. You're going to like the next part even less. Wait another week. See what else you can cut out. Yeah. Partial sentences are great in dialogue. The unsaid is almost as important as the said in dialogue. People glaring at each other instead of responding. That's totally acceptable in dialogue. In fact, I think it's a great idea to have because you're upping the tension. Now let's talk about that tension thing now, because I talk about how dialogue needs to have conflict and tension. And some newer writers are like, what do you mean? So everybody's supposed to be yelling at each other and having fights in every single dialogue? No, that's not it. It's just that often, think about it, when people are speaking, let's imagine a situation. They're two friends and they're speaking, and one of them knows that the other one was invited to a dinner party that they were excluded from, right? And they want to know where it was and how it was. And they're trying to get the information. The other person's feeling awkward about it because they know that it's kind of a weird situation. They don't really want to say anything. Think about how that conversation is going to go, right? It's full of tension and low simmering conflict because the two people want different things. One person wants to spare their friend's feelings and not give them all the info, and the other one really wants all the info, which might not be best for them. So see how this all goes. I think there's so much nuance that you can put into your dialogues, and definitely think drama, tension, and a dialogue moving your story forward. If your dialogue doesn't actually move your story forward in crucial ways, then you're going to want to either take it out or rewrite it. And I have so many writers who tell me, but it does move the story forward because it's all about character development. That's hunky-dory, my friend. I want character development in the dialogue, but it needs to do other things other than that, right? That's really important. So just know that characters don't always say what they mean. They don't always mean what they say. Think about the subtext in your dialogue. That's really cool because when you're placing emphasis on the unsaid, your story becomes that much more compelling. You start to build suspense, and you're definitely doing that whole show don't tell thing. You're providing clues, and the reader is reading between the lines. And I think that that definitely makes it much more compelling and interesting. So that's how you can absolutely edit your dialogue down to make it as brief as possible, yet still have it saying as much as possible. I think that that is definitely something that is possible. So remember, every dialogue needs a purpose, right? So let's rehash these: the exchange of information, for example, revealing the backstory, but doing this really carefully, because backstory, usually many characters don't want to open up about the past, or they don't want to open up old wounds. So make sure that you realize that, right? Make sure that none of your dialogue feels like it's this tool that you're using to reveal backstory. Even though it is, it shouldn't sound that way. Also think about, I also don't like to have too many people in my dialogue. So a lot of young writers that I see, they'll have these scenes where there are a bunch of friends and the friends are having a big discussion and there are like 5 or 6 or 7 characters and they're all speaking. And the reader has absolutely no idea what's going on. Or the reader has to go back and look and be like, what is happening? And is this even important? So if you have a scene like that, I think you really want to look and think to yourself, okay, even if objectively there's 6 people standing around in this scene, they're really actually there. Do those 6 people actually need to speak? Oftentimes, people are in a scene and they're listening to 2 main people have a discussion. And I think that a dialogue, the less people you have, the better. Having 2 people is perfect. But now, of course, you can also exploit that unwanted third character or the triangulation that happens when a third character enters the scene, right? What about the things that the characters don't want to say in front of this one character, or the new character just came in and they have to bring them up to speed, but they're lying to them, or the third character is trying to interject and put in their own opinions and trying to steer the dialogue a certain way. Think about all those power dynamics. That can be really interesting, but be really careful when you do it to make sure that it is absolutely clear and understandable and crucial. Once you've written all your dialogues in your book, look through it and see which dialogues are exciting or boring. I usually like to have dialogues where I come away thinking like, wow, that was really intense, or I almost got tears in my eyes because the dialogue was pretty dramatic. That's another funny little trick. Dialogue in real life isn't usually very dramatic. You have a discussion, everything else. But think about when you meet with a friend and you have a perfectly pleasant day, full of nice discussions, nice dialogues, you're chit-chatting away, and it's great. Do you want to read that in a book? I don't. I want to read the thing where it got really messy, your friend got drunk, started crying, and revealed something really deep and shocking. That's the kind of interesting dialogue that we want. You want a captivating, extreme conversation. So more dramatic than real life, right? And remember, also your characters, many of your characters are really interested in one thing. They have a goal, right? So they're going to be uniquely focused on that goal. The other characters they're talking to, probably not so much, right? So it's good to have characters on different pages, have one character that absolutely is focused on one thing, and that they maybe don't realize that the other characters aren't focused or have other priorities. And also, it's always great when a character is holding something back. I think that's really, really great. So the big question is, how much dialogue should I really have in my story? I have seen people write full stories where there's almost no dialogue at all. I think dialogue is really great. Now, I have yet to see a successful book that had absolutely zero dialogue unless the character is having interior monologues or thoughts because they're alone the whole time. That works out. But I think that having a little bit of dialogue helps with the balance of your story so much, and it just really does so much that why would you rob yourself of that, right? But look at that whole manuscript, like I said, and see what the balance is. I find that many stories come in at like 50% dialogue. I'm struggling right now with my work in progress where I feel like maybe I have a little bit too much dialogue. And I think I know why this is. I think it's because I wrote it scene by scene. And I highly recommend writing things scene by scene because I think that it really makes sure that each scene has a real purpose and that each scene is its own micro story. I think that that makes for really successful reading. Each scene has its own mini cliffhanger. Great. However, I think that I probably need to do a little bit more scene setting and look at that balance, because when I look at my balance of writing visually, I think that I might be at above 50%. And I like to manage to do just around 50% or less, but that is up to you as a writer. I know that there are a few books that have come out recently that are super dialogue intensive. And I think that they probably would be making pretty good movies as well. But that's another thing. You think movie, you think script, right? The dialogues in that, in many movies, there's a lot less chit chat than you would think. It's a lot of acting. So that's my final little hack on how to write really good dialogue. Ask around. Ask someone, what's the TV series with the best dialogue? Or what's the movie with the best dialogue? Now watch this carefully with a reader's eye and think to yourself, if I were writing this, which portion would actually be dialogue? And how would I write it as dialogue? That's a great exercise, is look at a great scene, play it, slow it down, write it as dialogue, as practice, and see how you can express that dialogue in the best way possible. I think you'll be surprised at how you've gained new skills and new balance, and is going to give you that critical eye that you can then turn on the rest of your writing. You'll be editing a little bit, that's fine, but I think that they say good writing is editing. Good dialogue is certainly editing, and a lot of editing out, a lot of pruning, and a lot of distilling down to the essentials. So that's it. Short and sweet, like a good conversation. I hope this really helped you out to think about dialogue in a few key ways. The power of words, exploit that in your writing. You are a writer after all. You're a wordsmith. You're good at word play. Play with it. Have fun. Enjoy it. Don't get too stressed out about it. And once you're done, ask your editor and your beta reader whether you did it successfully. And I'm sure that you'll be pleasantly surprised, or at the very least, you'll have something to edit. That's it. Thank you so much for joining me on this week's episode of the How to Be an Author podcast. I'm getting really excited for my online course, From Idea to Published in 6 months. It's really shaping up. And in the meantime, I have my other fabulous course, From Aspiring Writer to Successful Author, which you might want to check out to get a jump on all of those things you're going to need to complete the other course in the best way possible. And in the meantime, make sure to join my writing group. It could make all the difference to have a supportive community around you. If you have any pressing writing-related questions or would like to be featured on the How to Be an Author podcast, please feel free to reach out on my website, creativeandwritingcoach.com.